Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
And in this session, that provocation is, what is ontological design? And then we'll have each of our guests initially give their own sort of statement in response to this provocation. And then we, Owen and I, will be sort of throwing further questions to kind of guide the discussion. And this is supposed to be like a workshop / roundtable type thing where we're really trying to come up with new visions, new perspectives around this notion of ontological design. With that said, and Owen, I don't know if you want to add something as an introduction, but I'll be introducing the provocation.
Yeah, I think it's kind of fun in a sense to not say too much on ontological design itself. I mean, those who we will be speaking to, we are all familiar with the concept. And some of you in the room may have seen previous conversations Daniel and I have had around it, but precisely so that we can get everybody just like really thinking and associating around it. I'm not going to say that much about what ontological design is. The point is we're still kind of figuring that out. But what I will say is that I've been thinking about, Daniel and I felt there was some kind of synergy between the three speakers we've invited to speak tonight. And I was trying to work out exactly what that was, because it was initially something I kind of figured out intuitively rather than by deduction, say. And the best I've come up with is something like post-humanism in a sexed body. I think where these guys overlap, there's this real interest in how we can use new technologies and new forms of exploring virtuality in a way of redesigning or reshaping human subjectivity. But there's also a big concern in how do we do that in a way that doesn't mean we just blast off into our own fantasies and start talking about uploading ourselves to the mainframe with no relevance to to our sex lives, to our deep intimate struggles and paradoxes and tragedies of our lives. And I think this will be where we find some interesting synergy between our speakers. So with that said, I think we can open up, and I think Daniel and I think we'll speak to Carl first. Actually, Carl, if you'd like to unmute yourself and just share some thoughts around what ontological design is, what it means to you.
If I can just jump in, everyone who's not a guest today, please turn off your video, because we're going to just have the speakers' faces on YouTube. So if you're not a speaker today, just have a moment and turn off your video.
All right, so let me just jump in here before we start, and before Carl, we ask you for your statement. Let me just throw a very quick and overview of what ontological design is according to us, for those who may not be so familiar with the term. This is kind of that original idea that pulled us together, or at least it's our formulation of it. Ontological design is a design discipline concerned with designing human being with capital B. It does so by operating under one essential assumption that by designing objects, spaces, tools, and experiences, we are in fact designing the human being itself. And we believe that the ability to design human beings is going to be very central to survive the technological shifts of the coming decades while retaining a little bit of agency. So with that said, Carl, welcome. Let's start with you. What is ontological design for you?
All right, thank you so much, guys, and I've been really pleased to follow your work and to have discovered you, Daniel, specifically talking about ontological design. As you know, I'm very interested in sort of parallel movement to this, which is context engineering, and I think we are moving necessarily from a content-based model to a context-based model. And what I mean by that is that we can now alter our perception at a base level. So for instance, I've spent 20 years researching these different tools that will give us sensory augmentation, perceptual adaptation. So I've walked around with a headset that gives me 360 vision, for instance. So once you've changed your vision at a fundamental level, then everything else changes. So that's what I mean by context engineering. And you can not only do it with vision, you can do it with audio, you can change the way you hear the world. You can change your sensory, the way you taste. You can actually, there's digital taste now, so you can put your tongue in your phone and actually taste your meal electronically before you get to your restaurant. So this is the general gist, and I think that we need to move away from a content-based model because we've reached peak stuff. We're all suffering from a massive overload of information, and I think gaining mastery over our own perception is really the next sort of step in human evolution. And I suppose my early sort of insights into this were things like the fact that I was doing a lot of 3D modeling. So my background actually was history of art, computer science, and then architecture. And having those three sort of disciplines in my arsenal really meant that I started to understand the effects of technology on my perception. So for instance, I did a lot of 3D modeling. My first job actually was in Iran, building the Palace of Darius in Persepolis. So reconstructing that space, that space that was destroyed 2,500 years ago, was a sort of my introduction. So doing a lot of 3D modeling actually affected my dreams. So I started hacking my dreams. I started becoming a better driver because I was making these large 3D models of ancient buildings around the world. And I suddenly had bigger peripheral vision. I was like looking further down the road. So I was really interested in what was going on there. Like what does it mean like to do that much 3D modeling and therefore have that much of an effect? But what I also realized is it wasn't the same as gaming, right? So when you're not building the environments, you're not necessarily getting that effect. So it's a bit like sigils. You have to build them yourself. And I was also really interested, and I studied linear perspective pre-Renaissance. Sorry, I studied different forms of perspective before linear perspective took over. And I know Owen mentioned this in the previous Stoa talk. So linear perspective has sort of codified the way we understand space, and it's built into all of our image making. And unfortunately, we don't see in linear perspective, we see in curvilinear perspective. But because all of our cameras, all of our lenses are based on this linear perspective, that means all of our media is wrong. It's all fundamentally flawed. So I'm really interested in cubism and the multiple point of view as an antidote to that. And as we'll talk as we go through, what does it mean now that we're submerging ourselves into virtual realities, mixed realities, where linear perspective still has some position in there, but it's an opportunity for me to move beyond these sort of codified ways of being in the world. So I think mixed reality is a major ontological design tool, I think, because we are not only creating the content, we're creating the context. So you're literally living in an environment, you're immersing yourselves in an environment that you've built for yourself. So I think the danger is that when we start adopting these technologies, that we have the potential to degrade reality. Much like polyamory has the potential to degrade monogamy, and pornography has the potential to degrade the imagination. So once you've seen it, you can't unsee it and you can't live without it. So I spent a lot of time looking at different sensory augmentation devices. It's a wild west out there. You can basically put a new sense on the market. And Cyborg Nest have done this with the North Sense, 300 devices sold. As long as you say there's no medical benefit, you can actually circumvent any sort of regulation. So what does it mean? And there's a brilliant scene in Ghost in the Shell where they're all talking about what new sense they have got that week. And I think that's, again, what we talk about when it's context engineering, because obviously you change your senses, everything else changes on top of that base layer. So I'm also really interested in neuroscience and what's coming out of neuroscience. For instance, a smile emoji has apparently the same effect on the brain as a real smile. So what does that mean and what are the implications there? And also I do a lot of work with Imperial College London, where we're doing experiments with DMT extended. So what does it mean when you can absolutely plug into an orthogonal reality, a bit like it becomes it becomes electricity, when you're plugging into that, and you could potentially stay there. The idea of DMT extended as you're on a drip, and you can literally live inside DMT. You can literally use the third dimension to launch into hyperspace, potentially permanently. So to talk a little bit about what you and Owen are doing, Daniel, in this regard. So a quote from Owen: "Our condition is individual and not individual. The structure of personality has dissolved, and so have the control structures that hold us in place." So that might be a warning, but also it seems like a massive invitation, because I think the individual is a trap. I think it's a cul-de-sac. It represents the point of view. And I think, as Grant Morrison says, we need to become plex creatures. We need to enable this multiple personality, not necessarily disorder, but order. We need to be plural. We need to be multiplicity. We need to be multiple. We need to have this individual, seems to me like the next phase of consciousness. So we think of ourselves as individuals, but we're actually nested ecologies. So how can we potentially learn from something like mycelium, which for me is a much more intelligent species? And how can we use technology to understand? So if we could just walk around with mixed reality and actually see under the ground and see the way mycelium is immediately giving as soon as they're in abundance, if we could see that intelligence in real time, that would fix our sense-making apparatus. And I think, just this whole term transjectivity is a massive one for me as well. Ontological design gives us a wholesale opportunity to live inside our own cultures. The network paradigm and associated schizophrenia, which you point out, leads to transjectivity. And as Andrew Sweeney talks about, and Johnny V, the subject-object divide is a radical illusion. Relationship transcends or is much more real than the subject-object in itself. The transjective space transcends both the person and the thing. We need to understand that objects and persons are part of a living, breathing ecology of relationships, and that everything affects everything else. So if consciousness is a collaboration between subject and object, what happens to consciousness when we go transjective? And I think that I'm always building in these mantras into my everyday life. So I think we have to move beyond duality and non-duality to plurality, hybridity, and transjectivity. And I'll leave it there for now.
Beautiful, Carl. Before I sort of dive further and ask further questions about that, let me make a bridge. You mentioned something there about going beyond the individual and how it represents one way of being. However, there are others. And you mentioned the example of the intelligences of the mycelium. And what that reminds me, and as a segue to ask Raven to give her comments, there is indeed an intelligence in the body, in the evolutionary tree of which we descend. Indeed, our perceptions of time and our conceptions of individual, aren't they already kind of adaptations? Are we now shedding that part of the skin, going through the bottleneck and trying to figure out what evolution beckons us to do now? I think that's my takeaway from what you said, or rather, that's how I take that and throw it to you, Raven. Please unmute yourself and let us know, what is ontological design for you?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Carl. I think that's a beautiful segue. Daniel has accused me of being a biological optimist, and I've been really thinking about what that really means. And I think that going back to your description of the tie between the three of us, or maybe even all of us here, as being interested in the body, in the breaking of subject-object dualism, and that is being one of the core insights, I think, at the bottom of ontological design. And that brings me to this idea of eros, or erotic intelligence. If those of you who are familiar with the sex therapist Esther Perel, she talks about erotic intelligence as being that which is relational inherently, and as a form or an act of engaging and creating the type of relations that you want to have with the most intimate people that you bring into your sphere in your life. And so for me, I've been thinking deeply from the perspective of the subject that looks out from within. And that brings me, as I think about ontological design, from the most intimate out into that which is at the most distance. And on a personal level, where I am in terms of actually applying these tools, I think it relates to the deep principally first. I think that that's part of why philosophy is such an important practice. And not philosophy in the kind of pejorative sense where people are debating some sort of technical definition by some, person who was living 300 years ago, but the generative qualities of philosophy, of going back to the questions and asking, what is the nature of being? What are the things that are creating our environments, that are coming back and influencing who we are? Are we really individuals? I think that that principally should be a question that we're interrogating on our own and asking ourselves in our relationships, what are the implications of the fact that I am tied to others, that my existence is pulled by their influence and their impact on me if they neglect me or abandon me or give me love is something that I don't have a direct kind of individual control over. And these ideas, they are already designing us ontologically. The concept of the individual, of just atomization, alienation, of the hysteria of being online, we're already experiencing the worlds that others have designed for us. And I think that ontological design to me is it's a term that points in a direction and it's open. And I think that that's part of its brilliance in the sense that that also reflects the nature of reality. Like we are open systems, and emergence is something that we cannot inherently predict the outcomes of. And so as we're engaging with what it means to be human, what it means to be organic, we are engaging with open-ended systems. And ontological design is like an invitation or an opportunity to begin to construe the things that are already shaping our reality from a certain kind of vantage point. I think the other thing that ontological obviously invokes questions of being. It ties this term to philosophy itself, and which is different than I think context shaping, which is what Carl was speaking of, which ties it more to a kind of technical realm. But the ontology of things, the question of being, that really Heidegger brings back to us, and thinking about our relations, ourselves in relation, and what it means to be. And then design, I think, brings forth a sense of agency. It tells us that we can do something about it. As not only as individuals, but as these kind of spreading dyadic groups, creating not just fortified, individuals who can take care of themselves, but rather understanding what true strength is. Strength is not being a fortified, isolated individual. That's fragility, that's atomization. What we want is like a true sense of nobility, a true sense of strength. And ontological design for me is a way of beginning to understand the many different ways in which that's been done in the past. I think religion is a beautiful thing to look at in terms of considering ontological design, to go into a cathedral and to look at the architecture, to see how sound moves, to see the kind of like ecstatic experiences that are created when you move into these types of spaces. And I think space as a metaphor is a brilliant way of engaging with perception and with the senses. And ontological design can go beyond the designing of a specific space, although that's a very concrete way to begin thinking about it. You can think about how you cultivate your physical environment, what types of things that you bring into it. If you have, the opportunity, you can design your home to be related to your principles of which you're interested in designing. But I think a question for me, and this brings me back to biological optimism, is ontological design is also, it doesn't necessarily have a moral aspect to it. It doesn't say what you have to design your ontology for. And that, that's a deeper question. And I think that something worth considering is, what are we designing for? What kind of horizon are we considering? Are we thinking about ourselves within a year? Or are we thinking about our lineages within 500 years? What are we extending ourselves into? And how is that framing, influencing the design that we bring forth in the world? So there's this taking back of the agency that I think is vitally important. Don't outsource your design to someone else. And for me, it's like you can't design everything for yourself. So choose what you're designing, choose the things that you're intentionally working with and the things that you decide to outsource, and then begin to open from that position, which is where I start with the most intimate. For me, the thing that I ultimately do not want to outsource is my most personal relationships. Why would I want to do that? That doesn't make any sense. And I think that that's where sex comes in, right? And sexual difference and these difficulties that exist between all of us in our most intimate worlds. And so those are the questions that we've also been thinking about and discussing in the IDW, and Cadell and I have been doing a series on that. So what we're designing, I mean, that's going to really show itself in the future. Are we living in a world of human flourishing, or have we debased our own existence? Are we in line with the kind of biological evolution of our species that includes all of the emergence vectors that we are inherently on top of in some sense, or an extension of, or drawing into? Are we going all the way back to the beginning and thinking about the principles that are organically rooted in the origins of life? And I think that maybe the point that I'll kind of close up on is, I've been thinking a lot about the word generative, generation, and even gene, so this idea that what actually moves forward in reality is that which we can create within ourselves. So that which we can produce from our own experience, it's from within. And so we have to think about that. Like, where can you go? Can you go somewhere and produce the things that you need to design the world that you are going to flourish in? Do you teach your children those things? Do you bring your friends into that world? And that's like what I've been considering, because life, every single embryo is generating itself from its own subjectivity. And it creates within it the possibility of creating a new embryo. So what are we as living things that's different than the way in which, physical matter operates? These are deep ontological questions. And they have implications for how we end up designing for human flourishing. And I think that's where my mind is at in terms of the vantage point of considering the implications of ontological design.
Thank you very much, Raven. Yes, I'm reminded of this phrase attributed to Marshall McLuhan, this idea that we design our tools and then they design us. And I love how you focus on the importance of relationships. A relationship is not a tool, but the ways in which we relate to others, the ways in which we organize with other people, I find do function sometimes in tools, in the sense that they shape how I am able to interact and conceive of myself in relation to my environment. I behave differently around, say, my girlfriend as I do around a grandma, as I do around my boss at work. And one of the things that strikes me is that, like, very little, we don't have that much say in actually how relationships are construed. Very often, especially at the moment, there's a kind of script for what it means to be in relation with others. Monogamy, for example, or a traditional marriage or a non-traditional marriage. But we come up with signifiers, maps, images, if you will, of how we relate to ourselves and other. And this is where I want to bring in our final speaker, Cadell last, which, funnily enough, his name is last, so it goes quite nicely. The crown prince of negativity, if you will, who is who is doing his drum roll there. Yeah, let's think a bit more about relationship, Cadell.
Okay. Can I share my screen? I think I've got the button here. I'm sure. Oh, the host is disabled.
I think you can do it now.
Okay, I can do it. Okay, cool. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for all of that. And I can definitely sort of connect what I want to say with the topic of relationship. Well, I'll tie it in. Sort of where I wanted to jump off was in your own techno-social definition of ontological design. You guys have a short video where you define ontological design. And I recommend everyone who hasn't checked that out to watch it and to sort of see what's being said about it. One of the quotes I like from Daniel is said, "Reality is a technical problem," in that video. And then linked to that is that there's another philosopher who's talked about ontological design online is Jason Silva. And he sort of defines ontological design as this, and Fraga, you've had conversations with Silva about this as well, is that the crucial element of ontological design is this feedback loop of, we design and our design designs us. And then there's this constant feedback loop between the design and the design thing, and then the design thing affecting us, and vice versa. So with that as sort of a preamble, I just want to share my screen. I just prepared one slide that I wanted to sort of structure my definition of ontological design. So if you can see it there. So I wrote my PhD thesis on the title of it's Global Brain Singularity, and it's about the technological singularity. And in fact, the PhD thesis goes really nicely with the topic of ontological design. And I just want to offer sort of a dialectical attempt to sort of constrain the meaning of it, or at least offer a constraint, is that, at least from my vantage point, modern science was kind of this affirmative ontology of external being. So physics, chemistry, biology, sort of trying to develop an epistemological grasp of ontological being. And this is the foundation of the natural sciences. So you could say, like, the catchphrase for it is the map is the territory, at least in sort of a naive Newtonian epistemology. And then you have a postmodern turn, which basically turns to meta-reflective epistemology, so that the catchphrase would be the map is not the territory, and you get this hypercritical philosophy. And I think ontological design is a very interesting synthesis of these two, the modernist science and the postmodern criticism, because it's kind of proposing this epistemological ontological loop. So it's the map transforms the territory, and the territory transforms the map, and vice versa. And you have this constant map and territory transformation. So to give very concrete examples of this, and in the context especially of what Carl was talking about, is that instead of thinking about, it's not against science, but, instead of thinking about physics and chemistry and biology in some sort of modern ontology, I think we have to very quickly shift our attention to an ontological design view of science, which is to think in terms of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, robotics, atomic manufacturing, nanotechnology, virtual reality. All of these things are the consequence of scientific epistemology, which have ontological consequences. So it's no longer that we're just studying biology, we're actually engineering biology. It's no longer that we're studying the mind, we're trying to create minds. It's no longer that we're studying physics, but we want to redesign the physics of the universe. So this loop where epistemology and ontology are entangled with each other irreducibly, you know, this is maybe connected to the subject-object illusion. This might be connected to the idea of transjectivity. I like the idea of transjectivity as somehow deeply in the transmodern, you know, that it's transcendent of these paradigms. And then the questions I have when I think about this is, what is subjectivity in the actualization of the potential of scientific maps? And what does subjectivity want in the context of these of the actualization of these potential scientific maps? In other words, if humanity in the 21st century is going to get the power to redesign genetics, if humanity is going to get the power to design mind, manufacture atomic structure, what the heck? The full consequences of that power are unfathomable. I feel like ontological design in its full maturation is, to me, it leads to the recreation of reality itself. And simultaneously, postmodernism is sort of a dialectical clearing of ontology and opening up the possibility for something totally new to emerge. So that's where I sort of think my thinking takes ontological design, and that's in the context of the thesis. And really what I tried to do with the global brain singularity is introduce this idea that when we think the idea of the future of technology, we really have to try to think that in terms of this loop between epistemology and ontology, and bringing us to really thinking the core of subjective desire. You know, not what do we think, what do we want on the deepest possible levels. And yeah, so I mean, that we could take that many places, but that's sort of what I wanted to share.
Beautiful. I love how you brought in the question of like, what, I think I wrote it down here, what wants to be designed, right? So because the question of agency is so tied to the question of lack, that the order of things reverses. What wants to be designed through the pre-existing conditions that exist here? And then you took that and you drove it all the way to these far-reaching consequences. Now, there's to tie it back to let me make a comment on what you three said, because it was making a lot of sense for me, such as, what does subjectivity want? What wants to be designed through the current circumstances? We know that in the same way, we're all, you know, rebels against Descartes, and Heidegger was the daddy of them all. Subject and object mingle. They are currently, we're discussing how we can overcome them, how we can look at them as being in a loop, as being in a constant exchange, right? But then cause and causer, or cause and effect, are also disentangled, right? Disjointed, because who causes? Who designs? This is a very big question, like who designs? What the intelligences do this design? Raven, you mentioned erotic intelligence, because it beckons us to desire in a way that is evolutionarily advantageous. You know, biology and survival, they want to make us desire in such ways. Or we could even say, and Carl, this is part of my question to you, that these intelligences, especially in the age of techno-capitalism, become kind of autonomous. It is, while we also want to reclaim some agency and say that we can ontologically design some things, yes, we can, but we are also opening our eyes to the fact that there's other intelligences out there, other desiring entities. Let me give you this example. Classical example, Manuel de Landa speaks about the morphogenetic potential of materials, namely steel. So with steel, for example, there's only so many ways that you can fashion like a tube of steel. You know, because the material doesn't let you create things that are extremely flexible, etc. And so what happens is that the steel itself wanted to emerge in a way that possibilitated the steel tube. And then you add to that, for example, gunpowder, and it has in turn invented different types of ways to wage war, because it invented the rifle. And so who designed in here? Was it the human craftsman who built the steel? Was it the person who paid all of this supply chain to make it happen? Or was it the intelligence of techno-capitalism being an autonomous force at the same level as the biological intelligences of life and evolution? And said that, Carl, what do you think about autonomous intelligences? What do you think about, you're a psychonaut. Your intuition is up there with the best in terms of the narrative aspect of it. Tell me about that. Tell me about the sigils, about intelligences being autonomous, and about the conversations that you've had.
We've gone into some lengths individually on some of our techno-social talks on this, but yeah, I guess it's an interesting one. And if we think about the liminal spaces that are available to us, you know, I'm kind of always plugging in as much as I can. I mean, if we look at Aldous Huxley saying that, you know, it's essential to have holidays from the self. And you know, the whole point of life is to be in two places at the same time, which is where my double consciousness stuff sort of originates. So I'm really kind of I'm constantly practicing how do we get that new form of intelligence? How do we have access to two conversations at the same time? How do we, you know, plug into these DMT realms, for instance, that are having tremendous, what the research is showing, it has tremendous effects on neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, you know, healing. It seems to be there is an intelligence that's being offered to us through these plant materials and through butyl various with a 5-MeO DMT. So yeah, I guess that it's all about, you know, what can you garnish from an out-of-body experience, a near-death experience? How can you know, jump out of the point of view and into a field of view that a life review gives you? You know, that was that brilliant film Flatliners, where they go to the edge of life and experience death. You know, I've got friends that are sort of drowning themselves in the bathtub just to sort of see if they can see what's beyond the veil. So yeah, I guess for me, it's all around literacy. Death literacy is huge at the moment, and I think that we have to take a big opportunity to understand that life is a point of view experience, but death may well be a field of view experience. That's certainly my experience, having put a foot in that area. So yeah, I think that there's intelligences everywhere that are non-human, non-local. And I think that we just have to be brave to enter those realms.
That's such a cool one, because I think one of the coolest things that you're bringing up is field of view versus point of view, right? Because sometimes one of the areas where I feel like, for example, critical gender studies do not go far enough is that they stop when they're questioning perhaps the gendered words in language, right? That they should not be gendered because there's power relations in there. I would go even further, which is even the words here and there, I and you, within and without, don't they already imply a certain way of being in the world that is perspectival, right? That is point of view. What happens when we throw the internet as acid onto it? And what happens then, right? And I think that what that opens up is an extremely wild field of view, out of which, you know, in the era of techno-capitalism sounds a lot like a bottleneck, an evolutionary one. It sounds a lot like, you know, if we keep thinking in 20th century terms, in humanist terms, using the word individual, using the words, you know, using these old grammars, it's going to be pretty fucked to plow through to the other side of this acceleration, to move beyond the near future. What exists beyond the near future, evolutionarily? Do you care to speculate, Raven? Where does our species want to go? The intelligence that drives us.
Where does our species want to go? Well, I mean, it's interesting. Cadell and I have been kind of thinking within the context of the death drive and the libidinal drive, right? So, it seems like some of us want to die and some of us want to live. And what the motivating factors are with that, I think actually there's something deeply rooted in ontological design in those principles, because all of us have this these two kind of forces that are acting in tension within us. If we're going to just take this model of the death drive and the libidinal drive, where any living thing is also driving towards death, but in the meantime, it engages in a living process. And I think that this is once again where sex has particular resonance, because sex is this singularity moment where things are coordinated in the right way for two gametes to unite to create the generation of a new subject that will carry on that genetic code into the future. And this is how life has been nudging itself forward over the course of duration. And that's also what has allowed for these levels of emergence, right? So I think life is a great thing to consider when thinking about ontological design. You could think of a forest as ontological designers, in the sense that the forest produces the environment that begets its own flourishing, changes weather. It prevents erosion. Where I live in the Pacific Northwest, you can go into old growth forests where you're stepping, the spongy earth that you're stepping on is the body of trees. And below that is, there's mycelium in there, and all sorts of little microorganisms doing their thing, but really below that is rock. Like, these are sheer cliffs of mountains where the trees have produced the environment that creates this flourishing. And if we were to have just left them alone, they would be able to extend themselves into the future, until some sort of cataclysm, So the force of cataclysm and these filters of existence and the kind of unpredictable forces that exist for organisms that are attempting to persist their own existence. And this is also a force within us to persist our own existence. I think that there will be more asymmetries in the future, that there will be more inequality. There will be people who realize the tools and the stakes of the tools around us and become generative and take on their responsibility for themselves and the people that they love around them, and will generate things that are experimenting with flourishing, human flourishing. And there will be people who will be subject to the ontological designs that other people are producing for them. And you just can't trust that. I mean, already we're seeing that people are getting caught in all sorts of traps online. We mentioned, I think we already mentioned pornography. I think this is a great way of kind of focusing the lens on a specific kind of trap, where you have people who are engaging in intimate relationships with AIs. Yeah. And so it's like, what, maybe that's fine. The libertarian view is everybody knows what's good for them, and maybe that's fine. But like, what are we doing? Do we want to live that way? Do we want to have other people deciding how we engage in an intimate sexual way with ourselves and with the other? If the other is an AI bot, that's one thing. If the other is another human being, that's another thing. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of breaking apart, and it does look very bleak and dark to me. But I think that is part of why, if you have this call, you must take it, because we don't know what emerges from the things that we do. That's the whole thing about emergence. You know, it has the conditions of the previous emergence vector kind of as the limitations or constraints, but also it can't, the next level of emergence can't be reduced to the thing it arises out of. There are all of these uncertainties. The future is open. So if we're alive and we're living and we have the capacity to grab these tools and begin to create the world in the images that we see from the principles that we feel connected to spiritually, we actually can't know that we won't end up changing the course of humanity's progression into the future. We don't know that we won't. And I think that that in and of itself is a possibility for inspiring creative engagement with the life force. And I think that that is the life force.
100%. That's why I think that biological optimism can also be translated to heroism or the nobility. Who said nobility recently? I think
That was me.
No, there's a certain nobility in following that path, wherever it may take. The path makes the hero, or the circumstances make the hero. And who designs? But Owen, I'll let you do the segue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just interested. So we've had a couple of themes in the last couple of speakers talking about, well, death and apocalypse, and also contacting these autonomous intelligences. And I want to sling this to Cadell, because I know Cadell thinks a lot about death and negativity, but then also about psychedelics and ego death experiences. And I think perhaps, Cadell, could you share some thoughts on how psychedelics and other, say, powerful transcendent practices can be used as disciplines within an ontological design toolkit?
Yes, I think I can. So technically speaking, what psychedelics do is dissolve your ego structure, which is held in the default mode network of the brain. And this ego structure in the default mode network of the brain is linked to the a priori conceptual scaffolding of space-time. So when you undergo ego death, when you take a high dose of psychedelics, it's not just that your ego dissolves, your very notions of space and time, the basic ontological categories dissolve. Like the basic ontological categories we use to measure the world, to navigate the world, to identify what we call reality, all of that disappears, all of that dissolves, and you have a type of, transcendental state of consciousness. And that transcendental state of consciousness is not best described with categories like space and time, but with things like intensity, vividness, ineffability. And so using psychedelics as transcendental practices and discipline is basically to constantly shake and constantly disrupt what you think reality is. What you think is reality can all of a sudden be disrupted and replaced with something totally different. Like I often think, like, if you were truly a Buddhist, like if you were truly in a type of enlightened Zen nirvana state of consciousness or some form of enlightenment, that you could wake up in the morning in a totally different universe and be unfazed. Like that's how deeply connected you are to yourself. Like that you could wake up in a universe with different dimensionality. You could wake up in a universe with totally different conditions of possibility and be unfazed by that. Like the fact that we go to sleep at night and we wake up in the morning and there's continuity of what we call reality itself needs to be questioned when you go deeply into ontological design. I think that in that sense, at least for me, psychedelics as transcendent practices has been my gateway to these ideas, because before I started using psychedelics as transcendent practices, I really did have a naive ontology, meaning that I over-identified with categories of space and time. I over-identified with the evolution of matter. And once I really immersed myself in psychedelic practice, even these assumptions were lost. You know, so I really do think that in terms of like including yourself into the loop of ontology, this is the crucial for me. Including yourself in the loop of ontology fundamentally means that everything that you call being can be fundamentally changed, you know. And I think that, you know, what Heidegger's Being and Time represents as a 20th century book and a 20th century landmark is basically saying, look, guys, what you guys call ontology has yet to grapple with time at all. And as soon as you include time, everything that you think is fixed and static is going to disappear into nothing. So for me, in terms of a deeper practice than psychedelics for this is simply being with lack. You invert your desires. So and it can be very simple, like fasting, meditation, fasting can be even abstinence. It doesn't have to be any of these things, not in absolute terms, but to go into lack, to go into what is it to be interested in lack. Because when you're interested in lack itself, you're in the sort of the space where the pathos usually fills up an object without thinking. Like, I'm just gonna have sex, masturbate, eat pizza, whatever it is that you do, whatever it is your little pathic drive is. Everyone has a little stupid pathic drive. So to go into the lack is an invitation to bring your subjectivity to the place where you bring something authentically new into being. And you can radically even transform your presuppositions of what you've previously put into that placeholder of lack. And usually it's what you most strongly identify with.
Fantastic.
Okay, so that's it.
Let me just say a quick comment on that. Whereas perhaps in the past, if that's even a word that we can use without critiquing, but let's keep it for a bit. If in the past, you know, times of hunger made people search for new places with new food, or times of being attacked by enemies made them get like strong at war to defend themselves because the circumstances make the hero, because the environment designs us. We're today in a situation where the absolute choice, we can choose our lack, we can choose our own poison, out of which will result our vector. You know what I mean? So today we can pick which lack we have. Isn't that agency? Isn't that ontological design? We don't only embrace the suck, we decide and design and choose the suck as the engine of our, perhaps, of our lives in reality. So I just wanted to make that comment as something that made sense.
Nice one. So what we're thinking, we're just going to ask if any of the got a mouthful of food, if any of the panelists would like to just respond to anything that each other have said briefly before we then move to the audience Q&A.
Yeah, I guess what Peter's actually brought up is the question of practices, what OD practices we all do. So maybe we could just do a round of that, and I'd be interested in hearing Peter's examples as well, because he talks about infinite regress defense, performative agnosticism, weird stoicism as ways of maintaining sanity. Just a couple of mine. I mean, I'm involved in a project turning time into a subjective sense. It's called the Unwatch Project, And again, I mentioned this one to Daniel. So it's a watch you never look at, but you feel it. So it's basically vibration on your wrist. So a different vibration for hours, different vibration for minutes, different vibrations for seconds. And over a few weeks, you literally burn time into your wrist and turn it into a subjective sense. So what does that mean? Because the general gist of it is that the inventor talks about himself as the first astronaut of time. So once he's turned it into a subjective sense, he can then manipulate it. So a bit like when you're listening to an audio book at 1.5 speed, you kind of get used to it at 1.5 speed, and then you can't go back. So he thinks he can get 30% more time in the exam, etc., for the users of the watch. So I guess one of my big things is hacking time and understanding that the average lifespan is 1,000 months, and that's 83 years. So I think most people just don't understand that. They don't understand how short life is in terms of months. And I think having a big collection of anything, I've got, as you can see behind me, a big collection of vinyl at 10,000 records. Having 10,000 of anything means that you're very much more aware of time and realizing you've got like 30,000 days to live, and you've got 10,000 records, and you've already lived half your time, and you can only listen to each record once. So it's that sort of those sorts of techniques that I think are really useful to adopt. And then other things like the Seeing Eye project I'm working on with Mark Farid, who's an artist. He's trying to dissolve identity. So we talked about dissolving time, our sense of time. He's dissolving his own identity by adopting somebody else's. So he's going to wear somebody else for a month in virtual reality. So he's looking through somebody else's eyes, listening to their life. He won't have access to his own hearing or his own seeing. So he's chosen a month primarily because he wants to see because that's how long it takes to form habits. So can his identity be dissolved because he won't have access to it? I mean, it's another interesting area. And then I'm really interested in disassociation as well as a tool to radically reduce this brain chatter that we've talked about, with the ego constantly going on at you. And I think once you're released from that brain chatter, you then really do have a very different way of sense making. And it's kind of like driving the car from the outside of the car, like in those car games where you can choose to be in the car and drive, or drive from the outside. Having access to your backstage just leads to a much better sense making, much better decision making, much greater morality even. Another technique I would say is memory palaces. Jason Silva, in one of his talks, we build cathedrals, and then these cathedrals build cathedrals inside our minds. So, when I talked about the 3D modeling I've done, that led to me realizing I've built these memory palaces. And then I was like, well, what can I use those memory palaces for? So I mapped my PhD into one of these buildings. So instead of it being in a 2D flat form, which is kind of inaccessible, it's now in a 3D space where it can talk to itself. It can relate to itself in a way that it doesn't in that 2D space. And then journaling, I think, is a massive potential ontological design technique, primarily because it projects me again out of the point of view and into a multiple point of view, or out of my local view and into an overview effect, where I'm able to turn my life into an image, get a bird's eye view. Say I've been in a relationship for a year, I can see that in that year in a, I can read it in 50 pages. I can access that in an afternoon, and therefore I'm getting this bird's eye view over that relationship. I'm then activating pattern recognition, because I can see all the mistakes I'm making continuously just by breaking down that point of view again. So those are just some of the techniques I would mention.
Fantastic. I love your techniques. I've heard about them before. Just wanted to add one thing that I usually do, and it's kind of second nature. So that's why it is a way to perform ontological design. It's called creative apophenia, or it's a form of animism, right? So it's, imagine like a little bird stops on stops on my balcony right now, I look at it because it's a meaningful moment in the interaction, and voila, I'll notice him. I'll ask, what does that mean? Or sometimes you look into your perceptive environment within a point of view and you see, okay, I'm uncomfortable. I'm feeling annoyed, nervous. Why? So you look at it and then you attribute value. You do creative valuation to it. You create the new values as opposed to trying to fit that into whatever preconceived notions we already bring, that they have their utility because we all need to live in society. But the power to do this action of creative valuation, creative pattern finding, is something that can, if you do it well, and if you do it, it can get really like deep and intimate, and it provides unspeakable strength because all of a sudden you're grounded in your reality. Now, by the way, this connects with schizoanalysis, and schizoanalysis comes from, not schizo, but it comes from schizophrenia as a term, as used by Gilles Deleuze. And while it does have that danger of, like Owen said in the beginning, shooting off too far and perhaps attributing value to the wrong things or to the things that don't benefit our path, it's possible to put your eggs in the right basket. But it's the key thing here is to hear what the wind says, and the wind gives us all the clues we need. The environment designs us, and most of the job of the ontological designer is to do what the architectural phenomenologist Christian Norbert Schulz calls listening to the genius loci, to the genius of the place. What's already there? What does the genius want to say already? There's something to that. The pre-existences. Let's do the Q&A now then. Peter, do you want to pick up some of these questions? I don't know. We have a bunch of questions here in the chat.
Yeah. So if you haven't already, start putting your question in the chat, and everyone feel free to turn on their camera right now. Let's get some light in the Stoa so we can see everyone's face. You know, I'll start off with a question. So I wrote this above. I'm curious about the panel's thoughts about the culture war or information mimetic warfare is or can serve as a forcing function to becoming an ontological designer, perhaps starting off as a way to defend oneself from the constant gaslighting of mimetic tribes, military intelligence psyops, and black PR, etc.
Does anybody want to take that first?
When you say I'm curious about culture war, mimetic warfare, as in forcing ontological design,
as a forcing function, so as an opportunity.
I would say, you know, in the vein of our last video, Cadell on Neopolitics, yes, it forces us because the battlefield in the culture wars today is existence itself. It's not only what you think or what you desire, but how you desire. Even the very ways to articulate your own unfreedom are today valid field of war, something to be conquered and colonized. So the game is on. So again, that's why as a response practice, ontological design to me emerged as apophenia, as like, okay, what does this coincidence in my life mean? You know, I've just been through a moment of elation, listening to a song, looking at something beautiful. What does this mean? What does this take me to? And thus you create sort of a point of view navigation of an environment that is unlike the steppe of our ancestors, where the first animists, yes, they needed to hear the wind and to know where the river's going in order to get food. And thus they managed to create some narratives with gods and eventually science to solve that problem. But today the problem of chaos is kind of man-made, is you know, the spectacle of the non-living. And then there's a lot of saturation, a lot of chaos in there. And again, what I think we can do is use animism as the tap out of which we get the energy to ontologically design.
The other thing I would say is the framing of war, I think, is also very critical. In war, there are different ways of acting than in peace. And I think that part of kind of updating ourselves, particularly if we've lived in stable societies and we mostly exist in a world where violence has been sublimated and we don't see it in front of ourselves on a day-to-day basis, we think we're not living in a world of war. And also there's a lot of moralism. I mean, I think that this is something that Daniel kind of alluded to with questioning humanism. and what the kind of ontological frame that humanism gives us, and how it blinds us from seeing the things that we need to do in order to protect ourselves. In the introduction to ontological design on Technosocial, Daniel speaks of ontological design as a Second Amendment. A Second Amendment right, and I think that that's perfect. I mean, it's not a First Amendment. You know, this is like a freedom from kind of mode of being at this point, and it's because we're in a state of war. And we are all interfacing every day when we dip into Twitter, when we dip onto these emergence vectors of digitality. We are stepping into a battleground where we don't know who the enemy is, and but we can see phenomenologically in people's behavior, the adrenaline, the kind of barbarism at the fringes, the base effective kind of executions that are happening when people are removed from platforms or chased off or whatever. Like these are things that are simulating or are a kind of extension of our warlike nature as a species. And I think it's important to remember that, like, we're not in some sort of blissful, perfect paradise world. And that should be part of our calculations as we think about how to be. I think about membrane theory, right? So there is an inside and an outside, and that is determined by the membrane. Where is your membrane? Does your membrane include all the people on Twitter? Or does it include your sphere? You know, here are the people at the Stoa, or does it include you and your most intimate partners, your family, your friends that you live with, your children, right? So that is all determined on how much do you have to give, how much are you being transgressed in the war. And everyone has a different particular point. I think that that's another thing. Like, none of this is about being a role model. This is not about mimesis. Don't just mimic, because you are in a different vantage point. You're sitting different in a different place on the risk landscape. And the kinds of moves that you can make from your own position are different than the kinds of moves that I can make. So we have to give you the capacity to generate your own tools from where you are within the context of this war. And you can't really copy anybody else. It's the copying that's actually causing a lot of these more kind of emergent issues. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think I can try. I'm getting feedback, I think, from my I can try to engage with this question as well. I think culture wars and mimetic warfares have always been a forcing function of ontological design in some sense, because I think in the culture wars you have this competition of universality. Like, I think that, for example, if you think about the gender conflict, racial conflicts, religious conflict, and in the past more it was religious and nation state conflict. These were battles between competing worlds, and the battles, you know, Europe went to war over two competing religions for hundreds of years, you know, and what emerged from that war were totally different worlds that went into the war. So I think the wars today are more and more coming to the site of the body, and maybe, to what Carl's saying, to the very nature of perception itself. So the concrete example I would give for that is that in the 1960s, I think people often forget that not only was Malcolm X the #1 hated man in the United States of America, but so was Timothy Leary. So in that sense, I think that the culture war is the place where you see what new worlds are trying to be burst into being in some sense.
Yeah, just to add to that, I guess, you know, we're seeing a wide-scale militarization of things like mixed reality. 500 million HoloLenses sold to the military. But not only that, we're seeing this whole question of mixed reality being co-opted by city planners, and you know, brilliant article by Naomi Klein, the new screen deal, because mixed reality layers on top of language, layers on top of other operating systems, this ability to have your iPhone in your field of view rather than in this tiny bit of real estate that's zombified the world. But it's a no-touch solution, and the big issue is that we have skin hunger. Skin hunger is a real thing. If a baby is not touched and hugged in the first 2 years of life, there's massive black holes in its brain. So we're seeing that these technologies, which as we all know, massive double-edged swords, will be co-opted, and I think that's the danger at the moment. We're being plugged directly into the matrix. If you're not in the matrix, you're not really, there's no, you're not able to survive this pandemic. It's a crime.
I think I might add as a final quick point, it's already visible where ontological design is being practiced by some of the big digital players. I don't know if any of you guys have run the experiment where if you'd run a Google search for black people, what you get is a load of black faces. And if you run a Google search for white people, you get about 50% white faces and 50% black faces, which is bizarre. If you run a Google search for gay couples, you get loads of pictures of gay couples. If you run a Google search for straight couples, you get about half straight couples and half gay couples. If you run a Google search for European art, you see mostly depictions of black people in European art. There's a certain value system that goes on in Silicon Valley, and they are then using the Google image search algorithm to promote it. And it's subtle. If you're not looking for it, you might not notice it, but you can run the experiment. I encourage all of you to go and run it. And what this speaks to me is the digital landscape is not neutral. We are already it's beyond advertising. It's messaging on how to think and how to see images, if you will. And so what Raven was saying about this second amendment for the mind, I think it feels increasingly valent. Let's go back to Peter and go for the next question.
All right. We have a question. Raven touched on it. Max, you have a question on Gerard.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So basically my question is, we've been talking about mimetic warfare that's in the terms of memes as ideas, but I'm also interested in delving more deeply into mimetic interaction. So in the sense of us copying, having this deep social sense to mimic those around us. So my question is, what can we take from this deep impulse we have to mimic other people and other things that makes us so human? And how can we, obviously, how can we discard that? We don't want to just mimic, but how can we also embrace that? And how can we use this impulse to mimic for more inventive ontological design, if we can?
Mimicry. Yeah, the state of human beings. Yeah, I think that partially, even just having mimicry as a concept and beginning to use it to design oneself, I guess, let's say, if we can use concepts to generate our own insight about what does mimicry mean, what does it look like to you, where do you see it happening, what is the way in which mimicry can explain certain types of patterns in human behavior. Obviously, you can, read Gerard, who has done a great treatment of this, but I think this kind of gets back to the distinction within philosophy that I was trying to bring up earlier, is you should, rather than try and understand somebody else's point of view, although that is valuable, it's taking on their questions or their subjects of interest and being able to generate your own insight and your own kind of phenomenological feedback loops with engaging with the notion of mimicry. I think, in my life, especially as an adolescent, I think it's very common, peer pressure. People want to mimic each other. They have very superficial notions of status and success related to things like kind of overt displays. And part of, I think, there's something about getting older, especially if you are interrogating what true meaning is, or what are these deeper subjects that kind of get you entangled with reality in an intimate way. Things like mimicry of the superficial becomes a non-question. It's not of interest. But the question of what to mimic, I mean, I think Carl brought up mycelium, right? And there's a kind of a biomimicry movement in architecture. There are other kinds of things that we can seek insight from in terms of how to motivate our behavior. And if mimicry is something that's still really lodged within you, you can also seek people who are closer to your position, and see what they're doing. So rather than, looking far at someone who is within the landscape, let's say, of all the possible positions that any of us can be within, finding people who are close and seeing what they're doing and banding with them, I think, is another way of kind of subverting as you transition from being someone who mimics principally to someone who is actually generating your own way of living. And I think that's actually kind of part of literally our developmental process as humans. So like, this is something about what we go through as we age.
I would say that one of the things that the ontological designer of the hypothetical future, whoever is payrolling the whole thing, one of the things that they need to pay attention to, beyond the core engine of lack, that is the whole driver and kind of the cornerstone of the whole ontological structure or identity structure, if the project is a human or an individual. Another thing that they need to pay attention to is to have a place for mad wisdom. In other words, whereas most people, and this is normal, and this is the structure of at least the Indo-European tribes, mimic and exist within a, let's say, symbolic power structure that they did not generate, that is of their tribe, right? Divided between the priest, king, and the matriarch, so to speak. There also needs to be, even if for only a few of the ontological design projects that we create, there needs to be a place for mad wisdom and not for mimicry. And what that means is that there needs to be a space for risk. There needs to be a little box with a question mark, and that there are plenty of ways to look into that. We got an ideal panel in terms of psychonauts to investigate that. But the pathic experience that one derives from that mad wisdom place, that's the raw energy that sustains reality tunnels. Without that, there's no energy. Without that, it's just mimicry. We are just trading dead things. And we need to, because the ontological design is something living that we are, creating with this, it's kind of a biotechnology, really. I think we need to pay attention to that.
Let me build on that, Daniel, because I've thought a lot about, so Daniel saying lack is here the core driver and the pathic wisdom, and without that, it's just mimicry. I think that in order to shift into that mode, it requires that we understand what, you might call something like the pre-space or the before space. It's like the space before you act. It's like when you're, like, let me use a simple example that the space, the moment you desire something, like the moment I always give, the moment you desire pizza or something to eat, that moment right before is the lack itself. So, and most of the time, at least for me, before I really tried to acquaint myself with lack, I realized that most of my activity was very impulsive, reactive, more susceptible to mimicry, simply because I'm unaware of this space where, in some sense, the wave function has already collapsed without my consciousness being intentionally aware of the activity in some sense. So I think just being acquainted with that pre-space and being sort of putting your intellect in service of that is one of the core, ways to avoid, an unenlightened mimicry, let's say, because I know mimicry is not just bad. I think someone in the comments, Laura Cleveland, she said, mimicry is not just bad. So, it can also have a positive function, but just that it's reflective.
Yeah, just one point on top of that is how technology seems to be an enabler for this, because wearable experience as a new form of media is totally coming. I've also done a project, big European project on this, where we're able to use mixed reality to wear the expert. So you're sort of hacking the apprentice-expert relationship. So you can actually, working with astronauts, so we put the HoloLens on an astronaut, we can measure their head movement, eye movement, hand movement, and individual finger movement. And then you're literally, as a novice, able to wear them. And you can see where they've looked. You can see ghost hands where they've moved. So yeah, mimicry to a whole other level.
I just want to check with the speakers. Is everyone okay to stay maybe 5-10 minutes after the bottom of the hour? Or anyone have a hard start?
No time limit for me.
Cool. So we'll take one more question and then we'll land this plane. Evan, you had a question.
All right, yeah, give me 1 second to scroll back up. It was a while up thread. So my question relates to the sort of idea of breadth first versus depth first search. And I'm trying to find the exact way I phrased it because I like that, but it's very far up thread, so give me 1 second. Okay, so yeah, so I'm interested in you guys' thoughts about this. And so what I mean by this breadth first versus depth first idea is that there's a lot of talk in these spaces about developing an ecology of practices. And there's a lot of sort of samplings of various practices going on. And then, you know, this sort of contrasts with my own personal experience. I did a bit of the breadth first search and sampling of various practices, but I found it far more fruitful to engage in pretty deep study and practice of a pretty limited subset of the space of possible interesting practices, and got really good results that way. And so the ontological design process is super interesting, and I love this way of framing what's going on here. It does seem perhaps to bring in a slight predisposition to this sort of breadth first, like sort of doing the dissolutive process rather than the reintegrative process. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that dynamic.
Who wants to go?
I mean, I can say, like, first, I mean, I totally agree with this point that Evan's making. Like, spiritual window shopping is what this phenomenon has sometimes been called. And I think finding ways to avoid it is one of the core disciplines, if you will. I mean, like, for me, I do a lot of yoga and meditations, and then taking myself on some quite intensive visualizations and trips through the meditations, essentially. And that's what works for me, to the extent where I've kind of got a couple of images that hang over my perception most of the time now that I can relate to. I think there's kind of an element of, to go back to what we were talking about the pathic and the negativity, it's like finding a practice to the extent that it actually transforms you, and in some sense, like, it traumatizes you and thus transcends you. Like, there's a real overlap between traumatization and transcendence. I mean, perhaps a trauma is just a transcendence that hasn't been fully integrated yet. That's perhaps one way of reading it. Even a horrible thing that happens is totally not of your choice. The only way to heal from a devastating trauma is to find an integrator and to reconstitute your personality, your subjectivity at some kind of higher order level based on what had happened. You can't just go be a person as if that had never happened. And so within that, I think there is an element of finding the practice, the ontological design techniques, the spaces that actually invite you, as Cadell would say, to die. Part of you needs to die, and that's the kind of pathic element, something that makes you go, holy fuck, I didn't know that was possible. I didn't know I was capable of that, which is scary. But it's almost like this is perhaps the solution to, I think, spiritual window shopping is a response to fear. It's like, I'm going to pussyfoot around all of these things and never actually commit, in the same way that in the dating landscape, if you never actually find a person to commit to and to form something with and take on board the actual possibility of losing yourself in that, then you can get a little taste of everything. but never really experience anything beyond the you that is doing the tasting in that moment.
Yeah,
me,
just to, sorry, go ahead.
okay, I'll be quick. To me, it's a complicated one because it's a complicated one for everyone. We do live in a spectacle of saturation, but I always come back to this embodied sense of heroism, right? Biological optimism. Like, there have been other bottlenecks in history, and they have been fulfilled by every single one of your ancestors. All of them reproduced successfully. So, you got a pretty good background there. We are alive. That's a big question. That's a serious thing. So what we need to do is to look into our hands and find again that place within us through whatever means suit us. Doesn't matter, but find that strength to keep going once and again and again and again and forward and through and relentlessly, just like the fucking mycelium or the trees go, they lose their leaves and they gain the leaves again, and one day they die, but life goes on, and there's a profound force to be in there. As for the means, whatever works, and if you have to use 10 in a day, I don't know, why not? I guess that would be my answer.
Yeah, great question. I think, yeah, when it comes to this question of breadth first rather than depth first, I think there is an absolute fad, if you want to call it that, to have an ecology of practices. But to counter that, I think that magic is in the combinations. And as we mentioned before, understanding your time limits, I think, is very important to not be too, surface level. But for instance, I've just finished the Finders course, which is like 1,000 different types of meditation, then sort of honed into the best of the 26, and it's how those are stacked over a 17-week period. So you do a different technique every 3 days, and what you're essentially buying into is the stacking, is that ordering that's been sort of tested over many years, with lots of measures being taken from everyone. So for me, it's like, yeah, how much is too much? And like, for instance, like on a Sunday, I'll do 3 different types of breath work, and I'll spend 4 hours just doing breath work. And then you're like, well, is that getting too far? So I'm actually starting something called the Holotechnica Academy, which is about combining these different techniques into these novel forms of perception. So I think that it is create your own consciousness, create your own adventure, and regain your cognitive sovereignty through those magical combinations.
I don't know if I have anything to add to that other than that the spectacle of saturation and the spiritual window shopping, to me, a lot of the spirituality can be, like in our contemporary world, can become a type of spiritual narcissism, and I feel like in some sense, it's a question. The question for the contemporary human is, where do you find your limit? Because in the pre-modern world, we knew what the limit was. We were God-fearing, well, at least in the West, we're God-fearing people. You got the limit from the supernatural and the transcendent. And today, I think that we oftentimes have the structure of the ego parading itself around like God, whether that's in a scientific mask or a New Age mask or whatever it is. So to me, to stop this, the spiritual window shopping and the spectacle of saturation is just to find the limit of your identity. And for that, to me, the answer is death, which is to find death before death finds you. And if you're creating from that place, I feel like that's the best guarantee of truth. I had a talk today with a friend about how when Steve Jobs found out he was going to die, he questioned all of his activity, in his normal life. And to me, that means that he was basically doing something that was good for the world in some sense, but it was not coming from the deepest part of himself in some way. So I know for me, when I get, when I if I go into the doctor's office one day and I figure out I have terminal cancer, I don't want to have the earth-shattering realization that I've wasted my life and that actually everything I've done has been fake. I want to prematurely give myself a death-shattering experience so that I am here right now and speaking my truth as I want it to be, as if my deathbed were tomorrow.
That feels like a good note to leave off on.
I know it's not. I know it's not maybe not the fun. It's not as dark as it sounds. Because it's not as dark as it sounds because look, it's like what Sadhguru said. Everyone should take the time one day in their life to go to a hospital ward of people who have terminal illness. It's going to happen to all of us. It's not, unless you think you're going to be immortal and live forever, but then you run into contradictions of what the hell that means. And maybe we will become immortal, but we'd not be human. As long as we're human, I feel like we're defined by this limit.
That's why the gods envy Hercules, because he dies.
Daniel, would you like to close us off with any thoughts and maybe set us up for next time? This is going to be a series at the Stoa Ontological Design sessions.
Yes. So this is a series. So, first of all, thank you everyone for coming, for the awesome chat. Thank you to the panel for coming over, guys. Carl, Cadell, Raven, Owen, Peter, thank you for having us. And Owen, brother, once again, thank you for doing this. This session was kind of, introductory, was kind of going over a bunch of different topics. And I believe that one of the opportunities for the next sessions is going to be to, pick one side of it. Let's make a dystopian edition. Let's make a sex edition. And obviously the theme is still something we're figuring out. If you guys have any suggestions, feel free to contact and suggest them to us. Other than that, thank you all very, very much for coming. I appreciate it.
Very cool. Owen, would you like to have any closing thoughts?
Thank you to our sponsors over at Coca-Cola. No.
Don't do it. Too soon.
No, thank you everyone. See you soon.
Cool. So I'll make a few announcements in a moment, but I quite enjoyed that session, the first launch of the series. Carl and I were even privately messaging. I want to lean into that spiritual window shopping thing and have something like a spiritual buffet at the Stoa that Carl and I could use. So ideas are already bubbling up here, and I look forward for the rest of the series. So thank you, Daniel, Owen, and the roundtable for coming out today. To plug some events, tomorrow is going to be the last sort of session of the new year. David Fuller is doing his last unmaster class, broadcasting the sense-making web, and he's going to try to seduce me not to end the Stoa, so that should be fun. We'll see how that goes.
Yes.
And then we have in the new year, January 19th, how Rene Girard helps us understand our world. One of the leading scholars of him will be coming in, which should be quite fun. And we have a new series coming up that I'm quite excited about. Alyssa and Aaron are going to do some a shadow play thing. So Alyssa, if you can plug that.
Yeah, hey everyone. Aaron and I are excited to return with our event Shadow Play. This is an opportunity to explore the depths of the psyche, to invite the shadow forward and playfully engage with the contents. Time and date to be announced soon, so keep an eye out at thestoa.ca.
Beautiful. And Evan, our homegrown sense maker in residence for January. Evan, if you can unmute yourself and plug your series.
Sure. So my series is a continuation and a deep dive into the content I presented in the Stoa session I did earlier this month called The Bridge. And probably the best way to explain it quickly to this group is that it is the result of roughly 18 years of my own investigations into a toolkit for ontological design. That's essentially a good way to describe it. I don't want to tell people how to do their design, but I've spent a lot of time researching the available tools and trying to distill them into a format that is free of any of the specific traditions that I spent a long time investigating. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, feel free to check it out at 5 p.m. on Mondays in January.
Beautiful. And I sense there's going to be an interaction between the ontological designers and the bridge soon in the new year. More events, thestoa.ca with Patreon and Substack. That being said, everyone, thanks for coming to the Stoa today. Now we'll listen to some Joy Division.